Chapter 1, The World Before the Opening of the Atlantic. Section 2, Native American Cultures. In the last chapter, we talked about 4 civilizations that developed in Mesoamerica and South America. In today's lesson, we're going to strictly focus on Native American cultures in North America. And some of the earliest societies in North America, the first group we'll talk about are the Anasazi. They were an early farming culture that will develop in the southwestern part of what we now call the United States. And one of the crops they grew, of course, was maize, like other cultures we've talked about, beans, and squash. Now, in the Southwest, even way back then, it was very dry land. So in order to grow these crops, they had to develop irrigation methods, in which they did. They also lived in 2 types of houses. One of them was called pueblos. These are above ground houses made out of clay, or kind of a harder clay. Or they also built their houses still out of adobe, but they built them into cliff walls. If you look at the picture here on the left, that's an example of the cities and houses that were built in cliff walls. Here's one that's on the above ground I should say. But they did this mainly for protection. There were ladders that would come down into these areas so that the Anasazi can get to their places, but it was mainly for protection. They also built something called kivas. Kivas were underground ceremonial chambers that were held for religious ceremonies. We'll now move more into the interior of what we now know as the United States, and we'll start with the Hopewell. The Hopewell lived in the Mississippi, Ohio, and Missouri River valleys. So again, if you're looking at my map here, it's kind of in this area right here where you see most of those dots. So this is the Mississippi River right here. Missouri River will go out there, and the Ohio rivers will go there. So that's why it's kind of centered around this area. They were an agricultural group and a trade society, and some of the things that the Hopewell were known for were their mounds, these large burial mounds to honor their dead. So you see that in the picture here. This is a burial mound. It's kind of out in the middle of, in the middle of the woods there. You'll still see them around this kind of centrally located part of the Midwest today. Next, we'll talk about the Mississippian culture. And what they're known for are the hundreds of mounds that they built. And at the top of these mounds would be temples for religious ceremonies. Probably burial mounds similar to the Hopewell. And on my map here, you see where the Mississippian location is. Kind of around the same area as the Hopewell as well. And these pictures, some of you might recognize some of these pictures here. This is of a place in the St. Louis area called Cahokia Mounds. Maybe you've been there, but they are built by the Mississippian culture. North America will be divided up into several different culture areas. If you're looking at these maps, you can see the different culture areas in North America. But a culture area are geographic locations that influence society. So if you're looking, you have the Arctic up here at the top, you have the Subarctic right below them, the Northwest Coast, the Plateau region, California is this light green, the Great Basin, Southwest, the Great Plains is this big orange area, the yellow is one of the larger ones, Eastern Woodlands, and then of course you have the Southeast. All of them are different culture areas, but all the groups that come in those culture areas will have similar backgrounds, similar cultures. We're going to start off by talking about the Arctic culture area, and 2 groups of people that we'll talk about that will be influenced in this area are the Inuit and the Aleut peoples. So if you're looking at this map here, the blue area is where most of the Inuits would live. This is in the Arctic regions, and the red kind of show you where the Aleut came from. But part of their culture is fishing and hunting large mammals. Obviously, farming is not going to be one of their traits. So they fished and hunted large mammals, and of course, we're all familiar with Eskimos. This is the type of housing that they lived in the Arctic region. Next, we have the Subarctic region, and a couple different groups from this area will be the Dorgrib and the Montagnais peoples. They lived in temporary shelters, kind of a teepee-looking shelter, and they lived in these shelters so that they could move along with the deer. So they're kind of a nomadic group of people in a sense. They're following their food, so they needed a shelter that could be packed up easily and can be moved quickly to follow their food. The Pacific Northwest region is next. A couple groups from this area would be the Chinook and the Yakima peoples. They were known for building totems. You maybe have seen a totem pole. If you haven't, here's a nice picture of a group of totem poles right here. Basically, they were carvings of their ancestors or animal spirits, and they were built on these tall wooden poles. They also created things called potlatches, which were a huge feast to kind of show off wealth. Like the person who was hosting would try to show off as much wealth as he can, try to give stuff away to people as much as he can. It's kind of a competition, if you will, to see who's richer. The peoples of this area thrived on abundant game, animals, fish, wild plants. Here's an example of one of their inside of their houses. This is a house right here. And then if you're looking at this map, we'll expand it a little bit maybe. Okay, the Northwest would be in this, would be in this area right over here. Next, we'll move down to California. There are lots of tribes in the California region. Some examples would be the Pomo, the Hoopa, and the Yurok peoples. Mainly food sources in California consisted of acorns, fish, and deer. Also, the groups who lived in this area lived in kind of isolated family groups. So they weren't very large groups. It could range from anywhere from 50 to 300 people. And also in this area, over 100 languages were spoken. Now you can kind of see that in this map here of California, all the different groups, tribes that are located in the California region. Moving into the Southwest region, groups include the Apache, Navajo, and Pueblo peoples. Now, the Anasazi are from this area as well, so we know that the land was dry, it's a dry climate, and you had to irrigate in order to grow crops. They also hunted game, and they also raided villages of other groups. And here's some examples of homes. Here's an adobe right here. And here's the map of the United States. If we were to expand that, the area we're talking about is this area in the pink right here. Next, we have the Great Plains region. As you can see on this map in the green, that's the Great Plains region. These Indians hunted buffalo. That was their main source of life, really. They used it for making their shields. They used the buffalo for making clothing, coverings for teepees, which were the cone-shaped shelters that you see here in the picture. They also used the buffalo for really everything. Tools, anything they could possibly need was used from the buffalo. Also, societies were called matrilineal societies. What that means is that the ancestors of these Plains Indians were traced through their mothers. And for example, in our society, we are patrilineal because we're named after our fathers and we like to trace our history back through our fathers. In the Plains Indians tribes, it's a matrilineal society, tracing ancestors through their mothers. Some examples of groups from this area: the Mandan, the Pawnee, the Arapaho, Blackfoot, and Comanche peoples. Next, we'll move into the northeast and southeast portions of North America. We'll start with the southeast, and two tribes in particular, the Cherokee and the Creek. They're basically farming villages in this area. In the northeast, you have the Algonquin and Iroquois tribes. The Iroquois are famous because they formed an alliance called the Iroquois Confederation. These are basically 5 tribes who joined together to protect each other from attacks and in order to wage war against others. So you can see on this map right here, the 5 tribes are Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, Mohawk. Those are the 5 tribes that are part of the Iroquois Confederation. They lived in places called longhouses. And you can see on the map the northeast, southeast would be down in this area. So we just finished talking about the Native American culture areas and how different they were depending on their geography. But they do have shared beliefs, one being religion. Religion is linked to nature. They believe that spiritual forces were everywhere, dwelling in heavenly bodies and in sacred places on earth. Spirits even lived within animals and plants. So Native Americans try to honor those spirits every day. Individual ownership applied only to the crops one grew. It's not the land. Land was for everyone to use in the village, not one person's. Only the crops that you grew were yours. The land was for everyone, because they believed that they should preserve land for future generations. That's the end of section 2.